Commander Vraxos adjusted his ocular membrane filters as he prepared the day's lecture materials. His four-fingered hands, each digit ending in a suction pad that made soft popping noises against the control panel, deftly organized the visual data streams. 20 solar cycles of teaching at the Galactic Alliance Academy, and today might be his most challenging lesson yet. Computer, confirm content warning protocols are active, Vraxos said, his voice resonating with the distinct harmonic overtones of the Pelvarian species. Content warnings active, Commander, the system responded. Psychological support drones on standby. Vraxos nodded, causing the tendrils that framed his face to sway gently. The drones were likely unnecessary, but regulations were regulations. Especially now that humans had joined the Academy. The first batch had arrived just 3 lunar cycles ago, bringing with them their peculiar odors, their excessive vocalization, and their unsettling tendency to show teeth when amused. The Academy corridor outside his lecture hall bustled with the sounds of various species heading to their morning classes. Vraxos could distinguish them by sound alone, the heavy thumping of Gorgolian cadets, whose dense musculature made even their gentlest steps sound like small explosions. The high-pitched clicking communication of the hive-minded Zentrax, and of course the distinctive unpredictable rhythm of human footsteps. Comparative military history, Vraxos muttered to himself, reviewing his lecture notes. From primitive to advanced warfare across galactic civilizations, Week 6 the anomalous case of Earth. A notification flashed across his desk terminal. Class begins in 3 minutes. Current attendance, 27 cadets present, 1 approaching. The approaching cadet would be Lieutenant Jenkins, Vraxos knew without checking. The human was always precisely 2.7 minutes early, not prompt enough to seem eager, but never actually late. It was one of the few predictable things about the species. Vraxos had spent the previous night reviewing the footage compiled by Galactic Alliance historians. Most species followed a relatively standard trajectory in their military evolution: tribal skirmishes over resources, territorial expansion conflicts, technological arms races, and eventually, the realization that large-scale warfare was inefficient compared to targeted operations. Most developed species had eliminated mass combat centuries before achieving interstellar travel. Humans, however, Vraxos clicked his mandible appendages nervously. Humans were different. The lecture hall doors slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss. Cadets began filing in, a colorful assortment of the Alliance's finest young officers in training. Front row, as always, sat Krilzak, a Mantidian, whose rigid exoskeleton forced him to sit perfectly straight, making him appear perpetually attentive. Behind him floated Melnora, a gaseous entity contained in a specially designed mobility suit, who excelled at strategic thinking due to her naturally occurring multiple consciousness nodes. In the far corner hunched Tulgex, a metamorphic chrysalid, who preferred shadow and whose species' natural evolution from larval to crystalline adult form made them particularly sensitive to historical patterns of change. And there, slipping in precisely 2.7 minutes early, was Lieutenant Jenkins. The human moved with that peculiar bouncing gait their species used, claiming it was efficient though it looked to Vraxos like a controlled fall repeatedly interrupted. Jenkins caught his eye and did the teeth-baring gesture, a smile, they called it, which Vraxos had finally stopped interpreting as a threat display. "Good morning, Commander," Jenkins said, taking a seat in the back row. Several nearby cadets shifted subtly away, their appendages tucking closer to their bodies. "Indeed, the solar radiation period has begun anew," Vraxos replied formally. "Are you prepared for today's educational content, Lieutenant?" Jenkins' face underwent one of those rapid micro-expressions humans were known for. "Oh, I believe I'm prepared," the human said with an unusual vocal modulation that Vraxos' translator interpreted as knowing amusement. "The question is, are they?" Jenkins gestured to the alien cadets. Vraxos felt his secondary heart valve flutter with concern. The human knew what today's lesson contained, and judging by that expression, Jenkins was looking forward to it. The final cadets settled into their positions as the chronometer reached the designated start time. Vraxos activated the room's atmospheric calibrators to ensure optimal comfort for all species present and dimmed the illumination to focus attention on the main display wall. "Cadets of the Galactic Alliance," Vraxos began, his voice carrying that formal tone that had earned him the unofficial student nickname of the monotone monolith in Academy gossip channels. "Today we continue our exploration of warfare methodologies across sentient civilizations. Having examined the evolutionary patterns of the Gorgolian war efficiency doctrine and the Xentrax hive defense protocols in previous sessions, we now turn our attention to a newly admitted member of our alliance. The room tensed perceptibly. Several cadets turned their sensory organs toward Jenkins, who remained impassive, except for a subtle upward curve of the mouth. Earth Vraxos continued. Presents us with an unusual case study in military evolution that defies many of our established theoretical frameworks. He paused, checking that the content filters were indeed functioning. What you are about to witness may contradict your understanding of how intelligent species develop combat methodologies. I request that you maintain analytical objectivity. In the back, Jenkins coughed lightly into a closed hand, a sound Vraxos had learned was sometimes used to disguise laughter. Computer, Vraxos commanded, begin presentation sequence, Alpha, terrestrial warfare progression, Earth calendar years 1900 to 2100. The display wall shimmered to life, and Vraxos noticed with mild concern that Lieutenant Jenkins had adopted a posture that humans called sitting back with popcorn, a reference he'd needed to research previously, indicating someone preparing to enjoy an entertaining spectacle. That couldn't be good. The display wall remained blank for a moment, as the system processed Vraxos' request. He used the time to survey his class more carefully. Before we begin, it's important to contextualize what we're about to see, Vraxos explained. His tendrils twitching slightly, a Pelvarian tell for nervousness that he hoped his students wouldn't notice. Most civilized species in our alliance developed cooperative military strategies that minimized casualties while maximizing resource acquisition. War was a means of cultural integration, as much as conquest. Krilzak raised one serrated forearm, the movement so precisely controlled it seemed mechanical. Commander, is this why the Gorgolians developed battle sedatives to ensure their opponents survived conquest? Precisely, Cadet, Vraxos nodded. The Gorgolian philosophy maintained that dead adversaries cannot become productive citizens. Their neural suppressants allowed for conquest without significant loss of life. From her hovering mobility suit, Melnora's gaseous form swirled in the pattern that indicated she was processing multiple thoughts simultaneously. Her translated voice emerged from the suit's speakers with a musical quality. And my ancestors, the collective vapor nations, developed warfare based on temporary atmospheric alterations, changing the composition of air to render opponents unconscious rather than harm them. Yes, an exemplary example of evolved conflict resolution, Vraxos agreed. The pattern is consistent across nearly all spacefaring civilizations. As species develop technologically, they inevitably recognize that preservation of life, even enemy life, represents the most logical approach to conflict. A small chuckling sound from the back of the room drew everyone's attention. Lieutenant Jenkins had covered his mouth, but the sound had escaped nonetheless. Do you have a contribution, Lieutenant? Vraxos asked, stretching his neck membranes in what he hoped was an encouraging manner. Jenkins straightened in his seat. Sorry, Commander. Please continue with your contextualizing. Something in the human's tone caused Vraxos' tertiary digestive tract to clench uncomfortably. He pressed on. Today's footage requires special preparation because it represents a significant deviation from established patterns. Vraxos tapped his control panel. Computer, display summary statistics of human conflict, Earth years 1900 to 2100. A series of numbers and graphs materialized on the wall. Many of the alien cadets leaned forward, their various sensory organs struggling to process what they were seeing. Is there an error in the casualty figures? Asked Tolgex from the shadowy corner, his chrysalid form shimmering with concern. These numbers suggest direct, intentional termination of opposing forces on a scale that exceeds resource optimization parameters by 8,734%. The figures are accurate, Vraxos confirmed grimly. Human warfare historically prioritized the elimination of enemy combatants rather than their subjugation or conversion. A ripple of discomfort moved through the classroom. Several cadets adjusted their universal translators, certain they must have misunderstood. Melnora's gaseous form contracted noticeably. But Commander, that defies basic evolutionary logic. A species cannot achieve technological advancement while wasting resources on destroying potential labor forces. One would think, Vraxos agreed. And yet, humans achieved spaceflight while still engaged in what they termed Cold War, a global state of military tension. From his rigid posture in the front row, Krilzak's compound eyes seemed to be processing multiple calculations at once. Perhaps their planetary conditions necessitated unusual adaptation. Was their homeworld particularly resource-scarce? Jenkins snorted loudly, not bothering to hide his amusement this time. Vraxos looked directly at the human. Lieutenant Jenkins, Perhaps you could provide some insight as the representative of your species in this classroom. All sensory organs in the room swiveled toward the human cadet, who seemed to be enjoying the attention. Jenkins stood, adopting what Vraxos recognized as a casual posture that somehow still maintained military bearing. A paradoxical stance that seemed uniquely human. Earth has abundant resources, Jenkins explained. More than enough for our population during most of our history. We didn't fight because we had to. Often we fought because we wanted to. The translator systems throughout the classroom struggled to process this statement, causing a momentary feedback loop of confusion. Clarification requested, chirped Tolgex, his chrysalid form pulsing with agitation. Are you suggesting your species engaged in warfare as a preferential activity rather than a survival necessity? Jenkins considered this for a moment. Sometimes for survival, yes, sometimes for resources or territory. But sometimes for ideology, for revenge, or just because we were really good at it. A horrified silence descended upon the classroom. Several cadets subtly increased the distance between themselves and Jenkins. That's barbaric, whispered an Andromedian cadet near the front, her luminescent appendages dimming in distress. Jenkins shrugged. That peculiar human gesture that Vraxos had come to understand meant something between acceptance and dismissal. We prefer the term determined. Vraxos cleared his throat, a sound he had adopted after noticing its effectiveness when used by human instructors. Thank you, Lieutenant. Please be seated. He turned back to the class. I must emphasize that these historical behaviors do not reflect current human diplomatic protocols. The Galactic Alliance would not have admitted Earth otherwise. Several cadets looked unconvinced. The Zephyrian twins in the middle row had linked their neural tendrils, a sign of seeking comfort through shared consciousness. Now, Vraxos continued. We will first examine standard military evolution among established Alliance members before contrasting with Earth's development. He tapped his control panel again. Computer, display military evolution sequence 1, Gorgolian peace campaigns. The wall displayed footage of the massive rhinoceros-like Gorgolians in historical battle formations. The images showed precise, geometric troop movements, dispersal of neural suppressant clouds, and the careful collection and medical treatment of unconscious opponents. Note the efficiency, Vraxos lectured. The Gorgolian Fifth Peace Campaign resulted in the integration of 7 distinct cultures into their empire with a casualty rate of only 0.0003%. The class nodded appreciatively at this civilized approach to empire building. Vraxos advanced to several more examples: the Zentrax hive mind persuasion techniques, the Melnoran atmospheric negotiations, and the chrysalid metamorphic infiltration strategies. Each demonstration showed increasingly sophisticated approaches to conflict resolution with diminishing casualty rates. Throughout these examples, Vraxos noticed Jenkins becoming increasingly restless, tapping fingers against a knee in that peculiar human gesture of impatience. And now, Vraxos said, feeling a knot form in his central nervous ganglion, we transition to Earth's military evolution. He hesitated before giving the command. Computer, display human military sequence 1, Earth World War I, Western Front. The room darkened slightly as the content warning protocols activated automatically. A subtle shift in the atmospheric mixture introduced calming elements for species prone to stress responses. I recommend all cadets activate their sensory modulators, Vraxos advised, adjusting his own ocular membranes to their protective setting. In the back row, Jenkins leaned forward, a strange expression on his face that Vraxos couldn't quite interpret. Was it pride? The display wall flickered, and the classroom was about to witness humanity's approach to warfare for the first time. Vraxos had a sudden urge to call in sick. The display wall erupted into chaos. Mud, explosions, bodies contorted in positions that defied anatomical possibilities. Human soldiers charged across a hellscape of barbed wire and cratered earth, while artillery shells screamed overhead, their detonations sending shockwaves through the classroom's enhanced audio system. Computer, reduce audio by 60%. Vraxos commanded hastily, noting the distress signals from several cadets' biometric monitors. The footage continued in its muted horror, young men in primitive cloth uniforms climbing out of trenches into sheets of machine gun fire. Horses, actual biological transportation animals, galloping into metal storms that tore them apart. Chemical weapons drifting across fields, leaving soldiers clawing at their throats and eyes. By the 7 moons, whispered Krilzik, his mandibles clicking rapidly in distress. They're directly exposing themselves to enemy fire. Where are their force fields? They're remote drones. This is pre-technological warfare for humans. Vraxos explained, trying to maintain his professional tone. Earth year 1914 to 1918. But they had projectile weapons and crude flying machines, observed Melnora, her gaseous form swirling in agitation within her suit. Surely this qualifies as early technological warfare. Before Vraxos could respond, the footage transitioned to a scene of soldiers affixing bladed weapons, bayonets, according to the caption, to their projectile devices. Are they combining primitive and advanced weaponry? Asked Tolgex incredulously. Why would a species with ballistic technology revert to blade combat? From the back of the room, Jenkins spoke up. When you run out of bullets you use what you have. But why not retreat and regroup? Asked an Andromedian cadet, her bioluminescent appendages pulsing with confusion. Jenkins shrugged. Not really our style. The footage shifted to aerial bombardment, showing primitive human aircraft dropping explosives on population centers. Several cadets made distress sounds as the footage depicted urban structures collapsing with presumed occupants still inside. Computer, pause sequence. Vraxos ordered, noticing that a Zentarian cadet had begun to emit stress pheromones potent enough to register on the room's atmospheric sensors. Are you well, Cadet Folksall? The insectoid cadet's wings were vibrating at an alarming frequency. They're targeting dwellings. With non-combatants. Vraxos looked to Jenkins for an explanation. The human's expression had grown more somber. Strategic bombing. The theory was that destroying civilian infrastructure would damage enemy morale and production capabilities. But civilians, Folksall's translator struggled to convey the concept. Non-warriors. Jenkins nodded. War is war. Computer, resume sequence. Vraxos said after checking that Folksall's biometrics had stabilized. The display transitioned to a new conflict labeled World War II, 1939 to 1945. If the previous footage had disturbed the cadets, this new material left them stunned into silence. Massive formations of aircraft carpet-bombing cities. Armored vehicles crushing everything in their path. Naval vessels firing projectiles at targets over the horizon. Scale increased by approximately 6,000%, noted Krilzek with something like awe in his usually emotionless voice. How many resources were devoted to this conflict? Approximately 70% of involved nations' total industrial output. Vraxos answered, consulting his notes. What you're witnessing is what humans term total war. The complete mobilization of a society's resources toward military victory. The footage continued, showing increasingly devastating weapons and tactics. Then came a sequence that caused even Vraxos, who had reviewed the material previously, to flinch. A single aircraft. A single bomb. A mushroom cloud rising over a city. Computer, pause, shouted Tolgex, unusually emotional for a chrysalid. What was that? The classroom fell silent. All eyes turned to Jenkins. The human stood slowly, his face now entirely devoid of its earlier amusement. That was an atomic bomb. The first use of nuclear weapons in warfare. The targets were two Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Estimated casualties. Asked Melnora, her voice barely audible through her suit's speakers. Immediate deaths around 200,000, long-term deaths from radiation probably double that. The Zephyrian cadet, in the middle row, quietly disconnected their neural tendrils and floated toward the exit. Permission to be excused, Commander. Vraxos nodded mutely, watching as the cadet drifted from the room. He wasn't surprised. Zephyrians communicated through a form of empathic telepathy. The emotional imprint of those deaths, even through historical footage, would be overwhelming. Computer, advance to Cold War era. Vraxos instructed, hoping the less visually disturbing footage might give the class a moment to recover. The display showed massive stockpiles of nuclear weapons, submarines carrying enough destructive power to eliminate entire continents, and missile silos scattered across Earth's surface. Mutually assured destruction, Jenkins explained without being prompted. Mad. The theory that if both sides have enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other completely, neither will attack first. Krilzek's compound eyes seemed to be having trouble focusing. Your species deliberately created a scenario where you could exterminate yourselves multiple times over. As a peacekeeping strategy. Pretty much, Jenkins confirmed. And this was considered logical? Asked Melnora. It worked, didn't it? Jenkins responded. We're still here. The footage shifted to more recent conflicts, what the captions called asymmetrical warfare. Scenes of guerrilla fighters attacking much larger military forces, of booby traps and ambushes, of urban combat where distinguishing civilian from combatant became nearly impossible. I don't understand, said Tolgex, whose chrysalid form was pulsing with distress. The smaller forces have no statistical probability of victory against the larger. Why continue fighting? Jenkins' reply was simple. Because sometimes it's not about winning. It's about making the cost of victory too high for the other side. A third Zephyrian cadet requested permission to leave. Then a fourth. The atmospheric scrubbers were working overtime to process the stress pheromones filling the room. Computer, advance to contemporary Earth conflicts. Vraxos instructed, knowing they needed to complete the curriculum, despite the discomfort. The newer footage showed drone strikes, cyber warfare, automated weapons systems, and precision-guided munitions. On the surface it appeared more clinical, more civilized, but the underlying philosophy remained unchanged. The goal was still victory through the enemy's defeat, not their conversion or integration. Permission to ask a question, Commander. Krilzek raised a forearm, his usually rigid posture now noticeably tense. Granted, Vraxos replied. Lieutenant Jenkins. Krilzek turned to face the human directly, mandibles twitching nervously. Given this history, how did your species not exterminate itself before achieving spaceflight? The question hung in the air. Even Vraxos found himself leaning forward slightly, genuinely curious about the answer. Jenkins stood again, scanning the room full of alien cadets, who were now looking at him with a mixture of fear, confusion, and morbid fascination. Honestly, Jenkins said with that peculiar human expression, half smile, half grimace. We came pretty damn close a few times. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. But Jenkins continued, that's only part of the story. Computer, end presentation sequence, Vraxos announced, sensing an opportunity for an educational moment. The disturbing images vanished from the wall, replaced by the Academy's standard neutral blue background. The room's lighting returned to normal levels, and several cadets visibly relaxed. Lieutenant Jenkins, Vraxos said, his professional curiosity now fully engaged. Would you care to elaborate on what you mean by only part of the story? Before Jenkins could respond, a Draclonian cadet near the door suddenly stood up, their scaled skin flushing the deep purple that indicated extreme distress in their species. Commander, the cadet said formally. I request reassignment from this training program. On what grounds, Cadet Vorthan? Vraxos asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. I cannot in good conscience train alongside a species with such, the translator paused, searching for an appropriate term. Such disregard for life. No offense intended to Lieutenant Jenkins personally. Jenkins raised his eyebrows, but said nothing. To Vraxos' dismay, 3 other cadets immediately stood as well, making the same request. The classroom was on the verge of chaos. Cadets, maintain discipline. Vraxos commanded, using his rarely deployed authoritative harmonic. The room settled, though the atmosphere remained tense. Lieutenant Jenkins was about to provide additional context that may be relevant to your concerns. Vraxos continued. I expect all Academy cadets to demonstrate the intellectual rigor to consider complete information before forming judgments. The standing cadets reluctantly returned to their seats, though they positioned themselves farther from Jenkins than before. Lieutenant, Vraxos nodded toward the human. You have the floor. Jenkins moved to the front of the classroom with that distinctive human gait, a controlled falling forward that somehow conveyed both casualness and purpose. Vraxos made a mental note to study human locomotion patterns in more detail. First, Jenkins began, addressing the room of unsettled alien cadets. I want to acknowledge that yes, human warfare is brutal by galactic standards. I'm not here to sugarcoat that. Sugar-coat? Telgex's translator struggled with the idiom. To make something unpleasant seem better than it is, Jenkins clarified. The footage you saw is accurate. We humans have a capacity for violence that's, he paused, searching for the right word, remarkable, even to ourselves. Krilzak's mandibles clicked in what the Academy's xenopsychology courses identified as the Mantodian equivalent of a nervous tic. Then you confirm the concerns raised by Cadet Vorthan. Jenkins shook his head, a human gesture of negation that Vraxos had needed to explicitly explain to several alien species who interpreted it as a sensory-focusing behavior. What I'm saying is that judging humanity solely on our warfare would be like, Jenkins looked around the room, seeking an appropriate analogy, like judging the Zephyrians solely on their adolescent territorial lightning disputes. The remaining Zephyrian cadet pulsed with indignation, tiny electrical arcs dancing between their neural tendrils. Those are ritualized coming-of-age ceremonies, not systematic destruction. Fair point, Jenkins conceded. Bad example, but my point stands. You're seeing one aspect of human history without context. Melnora's gaseous form condensed slightly in what Vraxos recognized as a gesture of contemplation. What context could possibly justify planetary-scale violence and the targeting of non-combatants? Jenkins didn't answer immediately. Instead he turned to Vraxos. "Commander, may I access the presentation system?" Vraxos hesitated. This was highly irregular, but then again, so was this entire situation. "Granted, Lieutenant. Computer, authorized temporary access for Cadet Jenkins." "Access granted," the system confirmed. Jenkins approached the control panel. "I had a feeling this class might go this way, so I prepared some materials." "Computer, access Jenkins' personal file," the other side of the coin. The display wall shimmered, transitioning from the Academy's neutral blue to a split screen of images. On one side were scenes familiar from the previous presentation, human warfare in its various brutal incarnations. On the other side, however, this, Jenkins explained, gesturing to the right side of the display, is what happened after each of those conflicts. The images showed humans clearing rubble, rebuilding cities, constructing hospitals. It showed former enemies signing peace treaties, establishing international organizations, creating frameworks for cooperation. The UN, the Geneva Conventions, international humanitarian law, all these developed as direct responses to the horrors of war, Jenkins explained. Each conflict taught us something, pushed us to establish new limits on ourselves. Krilzak's compound eyes focused intently on the display. "You created rules. For warfare?" "Exactly." Jenkins nodded. "Rules about treating prisoners humanely, rules against certain types of weapons, rules protecting civilians. But the footage showed these rules being violated." Melnora pointed out, her voice resonating with skepticism through her suit's speakers. "Yes," Jenkins admitted. "We're not perfect at following our own rules. But each violation led to stronger enforcement mechanisms. When we discovered we could be monsters, we built systems to stop ourselves from becoming them." The room fell silent as the cadets processed this information. Vraxos watched with professional interest. The human was skillfully reframing the narrative, though whether it would be enough to overcome the visceral reaction to the warfare footage remained to be seen. "Computer, display timeline comparison. Human warfare occurrence versus peace duration," Jenkins instructed. A graph appeared showing that despite the intensity of human conflicts, the periods of peace between them had gradually lengthened over time. "We learned," Jenkins said simply. "Slowly, painfully, but we learned." Tulgex's chrysalid form shimmered as they processed this new information. "Yet your species was engaged in active conflicts when you achieved spaceflight capabilities. The history files indicate multiple ongoing regional disputes at the time of first contact." Jenkins nodded. "True. We haven't eliminated conflict entirely, but we had contained it. The last global-scale war ended almost 2 centuries before we met the Galactic Alliance." From his position at the back of the classroom, Vorthan spoke up again, his scales still flushed purple with emotion. "This contextualizing is appreciated, Lieutenant, but it doesn't change the fundamental concern. Your species seems inherently more volatile than Alliance standards permit." Several cadets murmured in agreement. The word unpredictable floated through the translator systems from multiple sources. Vraxos decided it was time to reassert his authority. "Cadets, remember your xenocultural sensitivity training. Different evolutionary paths lead to different behavioral baselines." "With respect, Commander," Vorthan continued, "there's a difference between cultural sensitivity and willful blindness to potential danger. The human capacity for violence is matched by our capacity for creation," Jenkins interrupted, his voice taking on an edge that made several cadets recoil instinctively. Jenkins tapped the control panel again. "Computer, display human innovation timeline." The wall filled with a dense chart showing technological and social developments emerging from periods of conflict. Radar, jet engines, nuclear energy, space exploration, advanced medicine, communications satellites. Jenkins pointed at each in turn. All of these either developed during wartime or using knowledge gained from military research. "You're suggesting," Melnora began cautiously, "that human warfare accelerated your technological development." "Not suggesting, stating a historical fact," Jenkins replied. "When humans face existential threats, we innovate at exceptional rates." "Fascinating," Krilzak commented, his scientific curiosity apparently overcoming his earlier distress. a sort of crisis-driven advancement model rather than the steady progressive development pattern observed in most Alliance species. Jenkins nodded. Exactly. It's not pretty, but it works. It seems unnecessarily wasteful, observed Tulgex. The resource expenditure and loss of life is terrible, Jenkins agreed. I'm not defending war as a concept. I'm explaining why humans developed the way we did. Vorthan's scales had shifted from purple to the orangish hue that indicated thoughtful concern rather than immediate distress. Your candor is appreciated, Lieutenant, but I still question whether humans are compatible with Alliance military doctrine. Our entire strategic approach is based on measured response and minimal casualty engagement. Jenkins smiled, a smaller, more subdued version of the human expression than his earlier ones. And who do you think insisted on adding Article 47 to the Human Alliance Integration Treaty? Vraxos answered before the cadets could, impressed by the humans' knowledge of diplomatic history. The Proportional Responses Clause was indeed a human addition to the treaty. It explicitly limited human military actions within Alliance operations to match established Alliance protocols. We know what we're capable of, Jenkins said quietly. That's why we put limits on ourselves. The classroom fell silent again, but the quality of the silence had changed. Vraxos could sense the shift from horror to something more complex. Perhaps not acceptance yet, but at least consideration. Vorthan finally broke the silence. I withdraw my request for reassignment, Commander. For now. Several other cadets who had stood with him nodded in agreement. However, the Draclonian continued. I propose a formal inquiry session, where we may address additional questions to Lieutenant Jenkins in a structured format. My concerns are mitigated, but not eliminated. A reasonable request, Vraxos agreed. Lieutenant, Jenkins gave that half-smile again. I'd be happy to. Though fair warning, you might not like all the answers. Better uncomfortable truths than comforting falsehoods, Krilzak stated, quoting one of the Academy's founding principles. Now that, Jenkins said with genuine approval, is something humans and Mantodians can definitely agree on. Vraxos was about to conclude the class when Melnora's mobility suit drifted forward slightly, the Melnoran equivalent of raising a hand. There's something I still don't understand, Lieutenant, she said, her gaseous form swirling contemplatively. If humans recognize the destructiveness of their warfare and have worked to limit it, why do you seem almost proud when discussing it? The question caught Jenkins off guard. For the first time since the class began, the human appeared genuinely uncomfortable. I'm not proud of the destruction, Jenkins said after a moment's consideration. No sane human is, but there's something else in our history of conflict that's harder to explain to non-humans. Please try, Vraxos encouraged, finding himself genuinely curious. Jenkins gestured to the timeline still displayed on the wall. In almost every major human conflict, you'll find examples of what we call uncommon valor, or extraordinary heroism, individuals who risked or sacrificed their lives to save others, often including people they didn't even know. Tactical self-sacrifice is common in many species' military traditions, noted Krilzak. This is different, Jenkins insisted. It's not just following orders or fulfilling a tactical objective. It's making a split-second choice to put someone else's life above your own, often with no strategic advantage. The alien cadets looked skeptical. Computer, Jenkins said. Display file Jenkins' personal archive. Heroism. Compilation. Vraxos watched with interest as the display changed to show humans in various military uniforms performing acts of what appeared to be spontaneous self-endangerment to protect others. Diving on explosive devices, running into gunfire to retrieve wounded comrades, standing guard over injured enemies. This, Jenkins said quietly, is what I'm proud of. Not that we fight wars, but that even in our darkest moments, this capacity for selflessness emerges again and again. The classroom was silent as the footage continued to play. The footage of human heroism continued playing. A medic running through gunfire to reach wounded soldiers, civilians forming human chains to rescue strangers from floodwaters, a lone figure standing before tanks. Though the contexts varied, the pattern remained consistent, individuals choosing potential self-destruction for the benefit of others, often strangers. Computer. Pause display, Vraxos commanded, his professional curiosity fully engaged. Lieutenant Jenkins, these behaviors appear contradictory to the warfare methodology we observed earlier. How does your species reconcile these opposing tendencies? Jenkins considered the question carefully. We don't, not really. It's just part of who we are, containing both extremes. Fascinating, Krilzak commented, his scientific detachment returning as his initial horror faded. A species-wide cognitive dissonance that somehow functions as an evolutionary advantage. Jenkins shook his head. I wouldn't call it dissonance, more like wholeness. The same drive that makes us dangerous also makes us protective. Melnora's gaseous form shifted into a pattern that indicated deep thought. You're suggesting that human aggression and human altruism are not opposing forces but manifestations of the same underlying trait. Exactly, Jenkins said, looking pleased that someone was beginning to understand. We call it passion or intensity. Humans don't do anything halfway. This complicates the risk assessment considerably, noted Tolgex, their chrysalid form pulsing thoughtfully. Standard alliance protocols evaluate species based on aggression potential, but don't account for this duality. Vraxos decided to push the educational opportunity further. Lieutenant, would you be willing to elaborate on how this duality manifested in specific human conflicts? The academic value would be considerable. Jenkins moved back to the control panel. Computer, display Jenkins' file, Wars and Aftermath. The full circle. The display wall shifted to show a split timeline. On one side were the devastating conflicts they had witnessed earlier. On the other side were the resulting humanitarian and technological developments. World War I, Jenkins began. One of our most pointless and brutal conflicts. Millions dead in trench warfare, poison gas, the works. He gestured to the corresponding entry on the right side. Afterwards, the League of Nations. Our first real attempt at a global peacekeeping organization. Also massive advances in prosthetic limbs, plastic surgery, blood transfusion techniques. Jenkins pointed to the next entry. World War II, even worse. Cities leveled, genocide, atomic weapons. He moved his hand to the right column. Aftermath. The United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Convention revisions, the Nuremberg Principles establishing that following orders doesn't excuse war crimes, and medically. Asked an Andromedian cadet, who had been silent until now, their professional interest as a medical specialist apparently overcoming their earlier distress. Penicillin mass production, battlefield medicine protocols that revolutionized trauma care, blood plasma preservation techniques. Jenkins replied, humans get very innovative when we're trying to save lives. He continued down the timeline, pointing out how each conflict had produced not only destruction but also reconstruction and innovation. The Korean War led to advances in helicopter medical evacuation and mobile surgical hospitals. The Cold War's space race, born from missile technology, led to satellite communications, weather prediction systems, and countless technological spin-offs. Even our more recent conflicts, Jenkins explained, produced unexpected benefits. Counterinsurgency operations led to better cultural understanding protocols. Drone warfare drove advances in remote sensing technology that later helped us predict and respond to natural disasters. Vorthan, whose scales had gradually shifted from distress purple to a more neutral blue, finally spoke up. This pattern seems deliberately omitted from the standard alliance briefings on human history. It was, Vraxos admitted, deciding transparency was the best approach. Initial contact assessments focused on risk evaluation. The capacity for violence was deemed more immediately relevant than the subsequent innovations. That seems short-sighted, observed Krilzak, and contrary to Alliance principles of comprehensive analysis, added Melnora. Vraxos found himself in the unexpected position of defending Alliance protocol. The initial assessment prioritized immediate security concerns. It was always intended to be supplemented by more nuanced cultural analysis, which is precisely what this course provides. Jenkins had been watching this exchange, with that peculiar human expression that indicated suppressed amusement. If it makes you feel any better, we did the same thing when we first met you all. Our initial reports focused almost entirely on your weapons capabilities and potential threats. Truly? Asked Tolgex, sounding surprised. Oh yeah, Jenkins grinned. We have entire government departments devoted to preparing for worst-case scenarios. There are detailed response plans for everything from Zephyrian electrical discharge accidents to chrysalid metamorphic contamination events. This revelation seemed to comfort the alien cadets oddly. Perhaps, Vraxos reflected, there was reassurance in learning that paranoia was a shared trait across species. Lieutenant, Vraxos said, you mentioned innovation born from conflict. Could you elaborate on specific technological developments that might be relevant to our cadets' future assignments? Jenkins nodded, and turned back to the display. Computer, Access file. Military tech to civilian applications. The wall filled with a branching diagram showing military technologies and their civilian derivatives. Radar, developed to detect enemy aircraft, led to weather prediction systems and air traffic control, Jenkins explained. Military GPS became the navigation system that guides civilian transport. Encrypted battlefield communications evolved into secure networks for everything from banking to medical records. The cadets were leaning forward now, their initial horror replaced by professional interest. The Internet itself, Jenkins continued, began as a military communication system designed to survive nuclear attack by having no central point of failure. Now it connects the entire planet. And medical advances, prompted the Andromedian cadet. Countless, Jenkins replied. Trauma treatment, blood preservation, emergency medicine protocols, even PTSD therapy, all developed or refined through military necessity and later applied to civilian healthcare. Krilzak's compound eyes seemed to be processing multiple aspects of the display simultaneously. This suggests that human conflict, while destructive, created accelerated evolutionary pressure for technological advancement. That's one way to look at it, Jenkins agreed. Though we'd prefer to have found a less bloody path to progress. Would you though? Asked Melnora, her gaseous form swirling in a pattern that indicated challenging analysis. Your species seems to thrive under pressure. The historical record suggests that your greatest advancements occurred during or immediately following periods of existential threat. The question appeared to catch Jenkins off guard. The human was silent for a moment, considering. I can't speak for all humans, he finally said. But I think most of us would trade some technological progress for fewer graves. The advances were a silver lining, not a justification. Vraxos noted this response with approval. It suggested a moral framework that, while different from Alliance standards, was not incompatible with them. There's another aspect we haven't discussed, Jenkins added, tapping the control panel again. Computer, display file, post-conflict cooperation. The wall showed images of former enemies working together. Japanese and American businesses collaborating, German and Allied scientists sharing research, joint peacekeeping operations between nations that had once been at war. One of humanity's strangest traits, Jenkins explained, is our ability to go from trying to kill each other to working together, sometimes within a single generation. This defies standard xenopsychological models, Tolgex observed, their chrysalid form pulsating with what appeared to be academic excitement. Most species maintain adversarial relationships for at least 3 to 5 generations following armed conflict. Humans have short memories sometimes, Jenkins admitted. It's not always a good thing, but in this case it helps us move forward. It's almost as if Krilzak began, mandibles working as he processed the concept. Humans treat warfare as a particularly extreme form of negotiation, rather than an existential conflict between incompatible entities. Jenkins looked surprised. That's actually a really insightful way of putting it. We fight hard, but once the fighting's done, we're often ready to get back to business. Except, Melnora interjected, in cases involving what your historical records term genocide, or war crimes. Those appear to generate much longer-lasting enmity. True, Jenkins acknowledged. There are lines that once crossed, take much longer to come back from. That's why we developed international laws defining those boundaries. Vraxos observed the changing atmosphere in the classroom with professional satisfaction. The initial horror had transformed into intellectual engagement. The cadets were now analyzing human warfare as a complex cultural phenomenon, rather than simply reacting to its brutality. Commander, Vorthan said, his scales now a contemplative shade of blue-green. I believe I understand the purpose of this educational module now. It wasn't merely to shock us with human violence, but to demonstrate the complexity of interspecies integration. Precisely, Cadet, Vraxos confirmed. The Galactic Alliance doesn't seek uniformity among member species, but compatible diversity. Understanding our differences is essential to effective cooperation. Jenkins nodded. It's the same philosophy that eventually helped Earth's nations form functional international organizations. We don't have to be the same to work together. We just need to understand each other well enough to predict and accommodate our differences. A most logical framework, agreed Krilzak. And perhaps, added Melnora thoughtfully, there are aspects of human intensity that might prove valuable to Alliance operations in certain contexts. Jenkins smiled, a genuine expression this time, not the uncomfortable grimace from earlier. That's the hope. We bring something different to the table, not always better, just different. Tolgex's chrysalid form shimmered with what xenopsychologists identified as the species' expression of epiphany. The alliance was founded on the principle that diversity creates resilience. Perhaps human aggression, properly channeled, represents a form of evolutionary insurance, a capacity the alliance has not needed yet, but might someday. The observation hung in the air, simultaneously reassuring and unsettling. Let us hope, Vraxos said quietly, that such capacity remains theoretical rather than necessary. On that, Jenkins replied with equal solemnity. Humans and Pelvarians are in complete agreement. The class chronometer indicated that their time was nearly complete. Vraxos was about to offer closing remarks, when Jenkins stepped forward again. If I may, Commander, there's one last thing I'd like to show the class. Proceed, Lieutenant. Vraxos authorized, genuinely curious about what the human might add. Computer, Jenkins instructed. Display file, Earth year 2031. First Contact Preparation Directive. The wall displayed an official-looking document bearing Earth government seals. Jenkins highlighted a section and enlarged it for the class to read. Based on our species' history of conflict, the First Contact Protocol explicitly prohibits any military demonstration or display of force capabilities. Earth representatives will emphasize humanitarian achievements, scientific advancement, and cultural exchange. Military history will be acknowledged honestly, if asked, but not volunteered. Our goal is to join the galactic community as partners, not as threats. Jenkins looked around the classroom. We knew how we might be perceived. We've been trying to be better than our history. For the first time since the class began, the room filled with a different kind of silence, one of thoughtful consideration rather than horror or academic analysis. Vraxos decided the moment called for a formal acknowledgement. On behalf of the Academy, I thank Lieutenant Jenkins for this candid and illuminating contribution to our educational program. The Pelvarian turned to address the class. Cadets, your assignment is to prepare a comparative analysis of your own species' conflict resolution evolution compared to at least one other Alliance member. Due next session. He hesitated, then added, Lieutenant Jenkins has volunteered to make himself available for consultation on human military history, should any of you wish to include Earth in your analysis. As the cadets gathered their materials and began to file out, Vraxos noticed something unexpected. Rather than avoiding Jenkins as they had at the beginning of class, several cadets were approaching the human translator systems working overtime as they engaged in conversation. Particularly surprising was Vorthan, whose initial distress had been most pronounced, now deep in discussion with Jenkins about what appeared to be historical military uniform insignia. Humans, Vraxos reflected, were indeed full of contradictions. Perhaps that was precisely what made them valuable addition to the Alliance. After all, a predictable ally was reassuring, but an unpredictable one might be exactly what was needed when facing the unknown. As the last of the cadets filtered out of the classroom, Vraxos found himself alone with Lieutenant Jenkins. The human was gathering his personal data devices, that peculiar subtle smile still playing across his face. That went better than expected, Commander, Jenkins remarked. Powering down his terminal, Vraxos's facial tendrils rippled in the Pelvarian equivalent of a thoughtful nod. Indeed. Though I admit I had calculated a 63% probability of at least one formal complaint being filed. The day's not over yet. Jenkins replied with that distinctive human vocal pattern Vraxos had learned to identify as dry humor. Vraxos moved closer, lowering his voice despite the empty classroom. Lieutenant, may I ask a personal query, one not appropriate for the official educational setting? Jenkins raised one eyebrow, a remarkably expressive human feature. Of course, Commander. The footage you showed the heroism compilation. Vraxos hesitated, searching for the right words. Was that a standard instructional tool, or your personal edition? Jenkins's expression softened. Personal. My great-grandfather is in one of those clips. Berlin Airlift, 1948. He flew supplies to civilians who just 3 years earlier had been the enemy. Remarkable, Vraxos commented. And yet you chose not to mention this personal connection during the class. Didn't seem relevant. Jenkins shrugged. The point wasn't about me or my family. It was about humanity. Vraxos absorbed this, his tendrils rippling thoughtfully. Your species continues to defy standard classification parameters, Lieutenant. We'll take that as a compliment. Jenkins grinned, showing those teeth in a way that Vraxos no longer found unsettling. As they exited the classroom together, they found Cadet Krilzak waiting in the corridor, his exoskeleton polished to a formal shine that indicated a matter of official significance. Commander Vraxos, Lieutenant Jenkins, the Mantidean began, his mandibles clicking in the pattern that denoted formal address. The Tactical Studies Group requests Lieutenant Jenkins's participation in our symposium on asymmetrical response strategies next cycle. Jenkins looked surprised. Really? Even after today's footage? Because of today's footage, Krilzak clarified. Your species' adaptability in combat situations suggests potential innovations in our standard protocols. I'd be honored, Jenkins replied. Though I should warn you, human tactical philosophy can get pretty unorthodox by Alliance standards. That. Krilzak's mandibles clicked in what Vraxos recognized as the Mantidean version of emphasis. Is precisely why your input is valuable. As the Mantidean cadet departed with a formal bow, Jenkins and Vraxos continued down the corridor toward the Academy's central atrium. Interesting development, Vraxos observed. Cadet Krilzak is being groomed for the strategic command track. His interest suggests a significant shift in attitude. Jenkins nodded. Humans have a saying, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Maybe they just want to keep an eye on the dangerous species. Perhaps initially, Vraxos conceded. But genuine intellectual curiosity appears to have superseded caution. As they entered the atrium, they encountered another unexpected scene. Cadet Melnora's hovering mobility suit was surrounded by a small cluster of various species, including two of the Zephyrians who had left the class early. At the center of the group, projected above Melnora's suit, was a holographic display showing what appeared to be human battlefield medical procedures. Remarkable adaptation of limited resources, Melnora was explaining as they approached. Human battlefield medicine evolved to maximize survival with minimal equipment under non-optimal conditions. But the trauma to the medical provider, a Zephyrian cadet objected, electrical discharges flickering between their neural tendrils in distress. The emotional impact of performing such procedures without proper facilities is precisely what driven their innovations, Melnora countered, her gaseous form swirling emphatically. The psychological burden created evolutionary pressure for better techniques. Jenkins paused, watching the discussion with evident surprise. They're studying human medicine. By choice? It appears your presentation had wider implications than anticipated, Vraxos observed. Commander, Lieutenant, Melnora called, her sensory apparatus detecting their presence. Would you join our discussion? We're analyzing the potential applications of human emergency medical protocols to Alliance exploration missions. Before either could respond, another voice called from across the atrium. Jenkins, got a minute? A second human approached, taller than Jenkins, with darker skin and a different uniform variation. Vraxos recognized Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez from the Academy's Xenocultural Integration Department. How'd it go? Rodriguez asked Jenkins. Any casualties? Just some wounded egos, Jenkins replied. Nothing serious. Rodriguez laughed. That distinctive human vocalization that still triggered mild alarm responses in several Alliance species. Better than expected. Then, listen. Tolgex and some others are setting up a viewing of historical human entertainment in the Recreation Dome. Apparently they want context for understanding human combat psychology. Jenkins looked incredulous. They want to watch war movies, after what they saw today. Not just any war movies, Rodriguez clarified. They specifically requested what you call anti-war films. Paths of Glory, All Quiet on the Western Front, that sort of thing. That's actually pretty insightful of them, Jenkins said, looking impressed. Rodriguez nodded. They're trying to understand the contradiction how a species can simultaneously glorify and condemn its own warfare. I told them you'd be the perfect guide, being from a military family and all. Vraxos observed this exchange with interest. The rapid shift from revulsion to academic curiosity among the cadets exceeded all projected behavioral models. Perhaps there was something about humans that catalyzed intellectual adaptation in other species, their contradictions forcing others to expand their conceptual frameworks. Commander, Rodriguez addressed Vraxos formally. The Cultural Exchange Office requests your evaluation of today's session. Initial feedback suggests it was significantly more effective than anticipated. I shall prepare a comprehensive assessment, Vraxos confirmed. Though I believe the outcome speaks for itself. He gestured to where various cadets were now engaged in animated discussions. their earlier horror apparently transformed into intellectual engagement. Rodriguez grinned. Perfect. Oh, and Jenkins. Admiral Kvzotic wants a word. Something about adapting the presentation for senior command briefings. Jenkins' eyes widened. The Admiral, seriously. The very same. Rodriguez confirmed. Apparently word travels fast when half a dozen cadets suddenly withdraw their anti-human petitions on the same day. As Rodriguez departed, Jenkins turned to Vraxos with an expression of bemused confusion. I don't understand. This morning they were ready to throw me out an airlock. And now they're watching war movies and studying human medicine. Vraxos's tendrils rippled in what humans might interpret as a smile. Perhaps you underestimate the impact of honesty, Lieutenant. Most species present themselves to the Alliance in the most favorable light possible, minimizing their evolutionary challenges. Humans displayed refreshing candor about both your capacity for destruction and your efforts to transcend it. We just figured there was no point hiding who we are, Jenkins said with a shrug. Our history is public record anyway. Precisely, Vraxos agreed. And that transparency breeds trust even when, perhaps especially when, the truth is uncomfortable. They reached the atrium's central junction, where their paths would diverge, Jenkins toward the human quarters, Vraxos toward the faculty offices. One final observation, Lieutenant, Vraxos said. Today's session was designated the anomalous case of Earth in the curriculum. I believe I shall rename it Complementary Evolutionary Paradigms for future classes. Jenkins smiled, a full genuine expression that Vraxos had finally learned to read correctly as indicating pleasure rather than aggression. That's very diplomatic of you, Commander. Not diplomacy, Vraxos corrected. Accuracy. The Galactic Alliance did not admit Earth despite your history of warfare, but at least in part because of it. Diversity of approach ensures adaptability in the face of the unknown. That's a much nicer way of saying keeps the dangerous species where we can see them than I expected, Jenkins replied, though his tone indicated he wasn't offended. Perhaps initially, Vraxos admitted, but perspectives evolve with exposure, just as they did today. Jenkins nodded and turned to leave, then paused. Oh, Commander, a word of advice. Yes, Lieutenant. You might want to cancel next week's lecture on human sports history, at least until they've fully processed today's material. Vraxos's tendrils stiffened in alarm. Is human athletic competition comparably disturbing to your warfare? Jenkins's expression shifted into what Vraxos now recognized as suppressed amusement. Let's just say that explaining why humans voluntarily concuss themselves for entertainment might be pushing our luck. I shall take that under advisement, Vraxos replied seriously, making a mental note to review the footage of something the curriculum materials called full contact rugby before making a final decision. As Jenkins walked away, Vraxos noticed Cadet Vorthan approaching, his scales now a calm blue indicating emotional equilibrium. Commander, the Draconian began formally. I wish to submit an application for the Joint Human Alliance Tactical Exchange Program. Vraxos's surprise must have been evident, as Vorthan quickly added. Today's class was educational. I believe there is value in understanding human approaches to conflict resolution, even if one finds them personally unsettling. A remarkably mature assessment, Cadet, Vraxos approved. I shall endorse your application. Thank you, Commander. Vorthan hesitated, then added, though perhaps it would be best if I completed additional cultural preparation before embarking. Lieutenant Jenkins has suggested something called hockey as an appropriate introduction to human recreational activities. As the cadet departed, Vraxos made another note to investigate this hockey phenomenon. The term wasn't in his immediate reference database, but Jenkins's earlier comment about concussions left him mildly concerned. Watching the continued discussions among the cadets, Vraxos felt an unfamiliar sensation, the Pelverian equivalent of pride. Today's class had achieved something rare in educational settings: genuine perspective transformation. The cadets hadn't merely learned new information, they had restructured their conceptual frameworks to accommodate contradictory data. And wasn't that ultimately the purpose of the Academy? Not to create uniformity of thought, but to prepare the next generation of Alliance officers to face the unknown, to encounter the unexpected and respond with curiosity rather than fear. The humans, with all their contradictions and complexities, their capacity for both destruction and creation, might just prove to be the Alliance's most valuable teachers in that regard. Vraxos headed toward his office, already planning modifications to the curriculum. The human literature segment would need expansion, perhaps with emphasis on their concept of tragedy, another uniquely human contribution, and the section on Earth governance models certainly warranted deeper exploration, particularly their remarkable capacity to incorporate former adversaries. The possibilities were, to use a human expression that Vraxos had grown fond of, endless. Behind him from the direction of the recreation dome, came the unmistakable sound of human laughter mingled with the various vocalizations of a dozen different species. An unusual harmony, to be sure, but harmony nonetheless. Perhaps Vraxos reflected, that was the most important lesson of the day. In a universe of infinite diversity, harmony didn't require sameness. Sometimes the most discordant notes created the most interesting melodies. And humans, it seemed, were nothing if not interesting.